Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. We are really happy to see so many of you actually joining this workshop today, where we are going to discuss we're starting the chapter, as you know, on energy transition and towards a new vision of energy, actually. And we're very, very pleased to have with us Brian Kamanzi from South Africa. He's working with the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. He's a researcher there. And you should have seen his video lectures. So today is really the opportunity to actually engage with him in a bit of the conversation about the particular case of South Africa that is in the video lecture, but also on the question of energy transition more broadly. So thanks very much, Brian, for joining us. We understand it's really fresh from the elections in South Africa, and it's crazy times for
Wednesday.
yeah. So
Wednesday the elections, yeah.
yeah, but wasn't there an election yesterday already?
The official date. I mean, there are various polls that are taking place, but the final day of
Okay.
voting will be Wednesday. Yeah.
It's on Wednesday. So
Yeah.
so that's really an important moment. So we understand all the activists are extremely busy. So we are very, very happy that you actually found time to join us. Brian, perhaps if you could bring everybody up to speed to some of the main highlights of this case study that you think would be important also for trade unions elsewhere, and also connected to elections. What place did the topic of energy transition took in the election campaign so far? How did it play out in the election, in the debates during the election, if it did? I suppose it did, but yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's nice to meet you all, and hopefully I'll get to know you a bit more through the questions. And thanks for those who've already gone through the lecture as well. I hope you found it interesting, that there may be some follow-up questions. I think just to start off with some of the context, is that the trade union movement in South Africa has been addressing and looking at the climate question at a political and at a policy level from as early as 2011. There was a landmark policy document drafted by the Congress of South African Trade Unions, at the time the largest trade union federation in South Africa, called the Climate Policy Document, which outlined the demands for an energy transition across mainly agricultural sectors, transport, and energy. Just a year later, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, proposed the notion of a socially owned renewable energy sector. And why did they do that? Essentially, in 2011, South Africa was looking to introduce renewable energy sources more into the into its public procurement processes, but using essentially private energy companies. South Africa's energy system is about 85 to 90% publicly owned. So the renewable energy, the growth of renewable energy was becoming at a very early stage associated with the entry of participation of private capital in ownership and operation. So Labour, from the onset, had a position to oppose this essentially. Now, the problem was that early contestation was ultimately unsuccessful. Electricity still remains largely publicly owned, but in the over the last 3 years, significant bouts of load shedding, rolling power cuts have eroded trust in the public utility, and essentially waves of market reforms that have been proposed in the electricity sector more broadly essentially mean that pre-existing problems like high levels of corruption, a corporatized structure of the state company, which has led and rising costs, rising input costs, led to essentially the state company becoming highly indebted, electricity prices rising, and performance falling. And this has led, opened up a gap for privatization. So virtually, a roundabout way of saying it, Lira, and to comrades, is that for the most part, most parties agree in the liberalization of the electricity sector. The labor movement does not, and is the main political force in the country that does not. The challenge, though, is that the historically strong block of unions, especially in the energy sector, organize the coal sector. But the renewable energy sector is largely ununionized. Most of the workers in the renewable energy sector are in construction. There's very low intensity employment in operations. And so the growth of the renewable energy sector has been left to private ownership and left to private capital. So you have a real political challenge here, right? And that's where the story about Komati, the case that you all have access to, is so important, because Komati was to be a landmark closure in the process of this new phase of the just energy transition, an international agreement in alignment with South Africa's international commitments. Now, this closure, it could have been an opportunity here to give some content into what Labour has been demanding for a long time, which is to include workers in the social dialoguing process, but also to really think about, when you say you want to transition, of course, it's a multi-sectoral issue. It's not only about energy. There's so many other things that impact communities and workers that are adjacent to coal plants. Now, unfortunately, we see the challenges of what a market-led transition looks like. The bypassing of workers in negotiations, then the issues around also the erosion of worker benefits, is that through worker struggles accumulated over decades, gains in occupational health and safety rules, gains in wages, gains in benefits around health, health benefits, education benefits, even for children, are lost when you simply transfer ownership at the same physical site to a private company who has no obligation to either continue the terms of conditions of employment or simply even to take on some of the workers who were previously located on site. And so, it's a really good expression about why what we need is important, but also why a challenge for the trade union movement here about also thinking critically about who is the most vulnerable and most likely to left behind. We still have coal plants in the region. So when that plant was closed down, many permanent employees, by the time the plant closed, about half the plant was contracted, outsourced workers. Think everyone from gardeners, catering staff, security guards, to some technical employees. Now, but for the most part, some of the most precarious workers some of them were still members of the union. Many of them had been working on the site for as long as a decade, but on week-to-week or day-to-day contracts. They consider themselves employees of the state company, but on the books, they were employed by labor brokers. At the time of the closure, the state company essentially said, we have no obligation you need to speak to your employer. We will ensure the transition for our state employees, which is what happened. So it really raises questions about how do we configure these, how do we ensure that a just transition is based around negotiation, and just transition is an outcome of a process. It's not something that you determine before the fact. It's to say, we have identified some researchers and consultants, we have researched the just transition policy. Here you go, here it is. We've built some solar panels and everything looks nice. No, a just transition is an outcome of a collective bargaining agreement. It's out of a process of negotiation. And I think that's one of the key lessons. And accompanying that is that the struggle to ensure that key policy decisions. Sorry, that the key policy decisions at a macro level also remain contested and contextualized. It's not simply about there is a tendency to make everything about trying to fix the power cuts and not understanding all the different elements or the impacts that the wide-ranging restructuring of the sector will have, both on reshaping how consumer bills will look in the future, but also on worker benefits, which will ultimately, again, end us right back where we started, which is a system that is poorly maintained and unable to deliver its mandate in delivering public services. And in fact, as I close, really foregrounding to the public that we are moving from a system that is talking about public services to about delivering commodities, to delivering electricity as a as a commodity.
Well, thank you very much for that very valuable input into the conversation, Brian. We can open now for questions or comments from people in the platform that have already watched the video lecture show. Who would like to take the floor first? Or has the comments in the chat box? While we wait for people to warm up, Brian, you are working with the trade unions for energy democracy, and we are going to discuss in the next few days with also other comrades from the same group of trade unions, the whole discussion of public ownership. And as you mentioned in the video lecture, big money is pumped actually for the participation of the private sector. Thus presented another capitalization opportunity for private companies. How is this agenda of public path to energy transition? What kind of challenges does it confront given such powerful interests that are vested into the just transition to actually pursue a different path, a path of which provides capital with yet more profit out of this process? How does that play in the case of South Africa?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And I want to start it by also saying, the messaging is that there is a wealth of private capital that is waiting to invest. But the evidence is telling us something quite different. First of all, less than 10% of electrical energy in Africa comes from private energy producers. Most of it is public. Investor confidence is low. There are many conditionalities that are required in order to increase private capital's participation in electricity sectors all over the world. The private capital investment in electricity is a concern even in advanced industrial nations in the global north. It's a major concern in the global south, and there's no reason, at least to it from the research that we've done and from the trade unions that we speak to in each region of the world, we have no reason to believe that the tremendous amounts of private capital they are projecting that will come just because it's renewable energy will actually materialize. We are finding that even where policies that are prescribing public and private money be blended together to fund infrastructure projects, that public investment is outstripping private investment, even within the model, the neoliberal model. So we are simply saying is that why should we, if the public is fronting the money, we are fronting most of the money, and even where there is more blending of the money that is taking place, there's a significant increase in tariffs, so consumers are paying, so public is still essentially paying. Why are we releasing other key levers within the system, which is around ownership and planning? Planning is absolutely important. Planning is a key lever in the process of transition, because we're moving. It's not just about technology. It's about the whole structure of the system. It's about the whole question about where risk. There's nothing that is given. There's risk with every project. How risk is distributed, and in the finance world, when they talk about risk, they're really also talking about price. And tariffs essentially. Your consumer bill is a reflection of how risks are distributed. So electricity, as a very brief segue, electricity revenue is typically gained from two sources: tax, so appropriations from national treasury and tariff. Now, if we are at a macro policy level, if we are not able to win the fight to advocate for and address questions around tax reform in our countries, if you want to embark on an energy transition, have more investments in infrastructure, whether it is public or private, you essentially need to increase. You only lever left is to remove the tariff, is to increase the tariff, and that is one of the key reasons why your bills will get higher in the context of electricity tariff, which raises questions about and affordability of electricity. So we say, we are going to be fronting up the money. We need to have access to all the possible levers to ensure equity in terms of access and affordability of electricity. We think about SDG 7, for example, but also as it relates to our broader demands and gains for the economy. So if we think about the trade union movement, we have many other sectors except for that are not just workers in the energy sector. Many other sectors which are interdependent. Electricity is a key input in everything from textiles to metalwork, you name it. I'm sure many comrades in here can speak to that. Is that there are also industrial ambitions within the trade union movement and within progressive sectors of civil society. So we need to have access to the planning mechanisms to ensure that where we make public investments, that our incentives that are given and fronted by the public are aligned with what is actually built and established, so that the distribution of benefit is in favor of the working class. Because we are paying for it anyway. There is nobody external that is coming to save it. There's no evidence of that. We'd be having a completely different conversation were that the case.
Yeah, it's not very different also from the discussion of many public-private partnership, PPPs, where we are told we need the private capital to come in, and then all of a sudden it turns out the state is still putting so much money into these schemes, and that the capital is really minimizing its risk, actually, so that it's not really a scheme to benefit the public. I don't know whether there is any hand raised, but in connection to the question, I'm just observing if there is any hand, but in relation to the question that you were mentioning also about the corruption of Eskom, Brian, one of the conversations we have had in this course has been really about the importance of moving beyond the state versus private, and to really put an emphasis to the question of public and publicness. So in the model that the labor movement is proposing, what's the new vision for Eskom, and what's the role of workers and communities in participating in decision making about this public pathway to energy transition?
Thanks. That's a massive question. And some of that I think is still being worked out. What I can say is this, is that an important thing to keep in mind is that we are currently in the process of unbundling and privatizing our system. So we had one that was one of the largest in the world, vertically integrated public energy system. So we are in a very advanced stages of having that dismantled. So, with that context in mind, the plan of the alternative is not necessarily at a detailed place, because there's many defensive battles that are being fought against rising electricity costs and also against the restructuring effort on its own. What I would say is this, is that our state company is highly indebted, and the National Treasury has offered money to amortize some of that debt, right? First of all, that's the only way we'll be able to keep the lights on and do what is needed to do, right? Unfortunately, though, conditions from our own National Treasury, this is not even from World Bank, IMF, from our own National Treasury, it put restrictions on the debt forgiveness to the state company, stating that it may not build or invest or seek investment for new electricity generation capacity. That is at the same time where the state is arriving at COP and asking for billions, tens of billions of dollars to invest in the energy transition along a private pathway, right? So essentially, what we are saying is that we have two compounding issues, right? We have external forces who are attempting to capture rents from the restructuring of our electricity system. And then we have government, local, domestic state policy, which is essentially preventing the state company that we already have from playing a more expansive role in the energy transition. So we want to block them and prevent them from doing that and ensure that the state company is allowed to participate in new generation. There's an exploration of different options for financing, for how to deal with some of that debt and making of new investments. The COSATU had put forward a proposal about how to use the state pension scheme, pension investment scheme, to let's put our pension money and let's essentially take a chance on our country and try and fix what is available. And ultimately that hasn't come to pass, and we've gone, and most of the money has come still from the public, from the National Treasury. So it is to say, again, I want to foreground this to say, workers are saying we should we need to clean up the act of the state company, take on and challenge corruption, but also we will take on the share of, we'll be taking on the share of reinvesting in the state company, whether that's through taxes or whether that's through the pension investment scheme. What must come alongside that? Improvements in workplace democracy. So there's the shop floor, and then there's the governance layer. There's only one representative, I think, from the trade union movement on the board of Eskom. The governance structure of Eskom has become highly corporatized. The company itself is being split up into three separate companies: generation, transmission, and distribution. So what was once one big corporate structure will now be three corporate structures. So in a way, your question, Lira, in a 1 year will be 3 times more difficult for me to answer. So it is, in other words, comrades, it is a struggle. There are proposals on the table. We are fitting the bill already. We have plans about where else some of that money could come from. We want to improve worker participation at the shop floor. We want to increase worker participations on company boards, on the public company boards. And we also want more progressives employed in the executive and in the company boards to ensure that the state company also has an outlook that is pro-public. Because even within the last few years, we've had CEOs, our last CEO of the state company, one of his first statements after taking over was that the state company is a dead horse, and that he believed in privatization. This was the CEO appointed of the state energy company. Yeah. We've had different CEOs who've had different outlooks. So and by consequences have had different outcomes and have had different relationships with organized labor. It's obviously not perfect, but it's to say that it is relevant and it is important. And it is possible to influence the ruling party to make those appointments so that we can continue to transform the public company to deliver on its mandate. The last thing I will say, though, is that the state energy company has a close relationship with municipalities. Municipalities are the last point of call for ensuring that the service is delivered to customer households. Now, municipalities have their own challenge. They themselves are chronically underfunded. And that's where your point about communities is critically important. We need to build alliances with municipal workers, with community organizations who are really concerned about the rising electricity prices, and say this neoliberal model of funding electricity is not working. Is that higher and higher prices are not going to deliver increased public services. What they are going to do is to ensure secure rents that are mostly going to be leaving the country. We need a different model that looks at how we are financing new infrastructure, but also that is looking at how a whole nest of other complementary and connected infrastructure services are remunerated and adequately resourced and staffed, so that we can have local governments that are functioning correctly, that are working in an ecosystem with a public company that is actually capable of delivering its mandate.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's quite challenging though. I don't want to ask you in a year what's going to happen after the unbundling, but hopefully there'll be something to stop that one. There are a few questions in the chat. Erica, why don't you make the questions yourself? I think you had two.
Okay. Hi, Brian. I'm Erica. Sorry, I cannot put my camera on, but I'm a big fan of your work. I follow you on Twitter and I knew you before this, so big fan, just fun galling. My question is, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on the Just Energy Transition Partnership, the JETPs given to South Africa at COP26 in 2021, and also the load shedding crisis in South Africa. I do know just recently there was like a load shedding crisis, level 7 or level 6, and yeah, how to navigate around that.
Okay, so we quickly start with the JETP issue. So the JETP and many other colleagues on the call, you may know it. It's a new model that is emerging out of the COP processes. There's several other countries that now have just energy transition proposals, just energy transition partnership proposals. Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, Senegal, Colombia is also looking at one. And there are many other countries in the global south that are looking at this vehicle, essentially, to help finance the energy transition in their local countries. There are a few big problems with it. So the first one I'll say from the trade union movement side is that the principle of social dialogue was never respected. The negotiating teams explicitly excluded participation from both civil society and the trade union movement. And by the time negotiations had concluded and the plans were actually presented to Parliament and to Cabinet, there had been no public consultation that had taken place. Consultation was taken after the plans were proposed, so essentially after the fact, and after submissions were given. And I can forward to anybody who's interested. You just send an email and send you what we assisted Komati with developing the response to the South African JET investment plan. That essentially most of the key structural concerns raised by the trade union movement were not even reflected in the stakeholder feedback. So that is to say, they came with a plan. The boundaries of the plan were predetermined and prearranged. They wanted to restructure. The electricity system. They have a particular vision of what that looks like. They believe that private capital will play a key role in the energy transition. That private capital will mostly be owning new renewable energy generation, and it is implicit that we will be mostly importing these technologies. There's no mention of any technology transfer agreements. It's not even on the table, even though that was raised by the trade union movement for years. There's no discussion about the possibility of industrial policies that is looking at targeting and ensuring localization of new value chains are ensured in the country. There's a real focus on they call it creating an enabling environment. So that is to say, build as much renewable energy as possible and the industry will follow. We say, okay, if we're giving incentives to renewable energy, why don't we have provisions that are ensuring decent work and that are ensuring very specific and clearly articulated benefits for associated communities and workers working on site, as they do in their home countries, by the way. The United States is a party of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And for their own bill, the Infrastructure Reduction Act, which we cited in our own negotiations, in our own responses to this JETP, they have the provisions for themselves that say that companies that are getting tax exemptions or tax credits as part of the Inflation Reduction Act must hire union labor. But when they give us the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, they don't even want labor in the room because they feel they can get away with it. So we have two layers of problems. First layer is that our governments are participating in the marginalization of the trade union movement and progressive community organizations, and that the other part of it is that the global North actors who share the majority of the blame for the climate crisis that we are in, the topic of the very conversation we are having, are deeply invested in promoting policies that ensure that they capture maximum benefit from the energy transition, because they have ambitions about how they want to industrialize their economy and capture new value chains, right? So we need to force open the door. The just energy it's unclear. The just energy transition partnerships have not lived up to their mandates. So that money, most of that money doesn't exist yet. A lot of it is commitments, which we knew it would happen. And even in their own stated plans, the money that was promised from the partnership is dwarfed compared to what they say themselves is going to be required from the public to finance new transmission and to address the existing debt of the state company. So it goes back to the earlier point. We know the public's going to have to pay anyway, but we are being made to ask major structural reforms for small sums of money from very influential global north countries, right? So they say, well, we need to. A genuine partnership should not be taking your ability to plan away from you. We want genuine partnerships that are based on cooperation, and it may come, and this is an argument that when you'll hear more from some of my colleagues at TUED, but essentially when we're discussing to trade unions in other regions, there's really a concern here that we are engaging in a lot of bilateral negotiations, which is weakening us, right? Different countries have different strengths and are at different positions in this historical moment. We need to encourage more multilateral negotiations, regional negotiations, and forums of collective bargaining that includes labor and civil society, so that we can pool our strength and make also and ensure that there's more accountability on important structural elements of our demand, like equity, like accountability, who's responsible for the climate crisis, what is the commitment around grants versus loans. There's a lot of debate about, we should have more grants instead of loans. JETPs should be more grants instead of loans. This is my personal opinion, I'm not speaking for anyone else. The JETPs were never going to be mostly grants. That was maybe a desire from civil society. There's no documentation, there's no reason to expect that the actors that are party to the Just Energy Transition Partnerships were going to grant South Africa $8.5 billion. They never said that. If that's what we want, we are essentially talking about a totally different compact, potentially with different actors. And we should feel empowered to demand that and to negotiate that. The second question on load shedding, very quickly, is to say that load shedding is part of two issues. The first issue is that it's poor maintenance and investment in the existing public infrastructure. Unfortunately, and we have that in many parts of the African continent, many parts of the world, right? Where you have poor investment in maintenance, you have poor outcomes of your existing infrastructure, which leads to poor quality of services, right? Now, that is not going to improve if we do not see the state company. Nobody's going to buy those coal plants. The coal plants are not going to disappear tomorrow. It's unfortunate that the existing infrastructure today we have is mostly coal. We need to reinvest in them to ensure that they are adequately staffed, to perform, and that the adequate procurement processes are in place to ensure that they can perform at the level they need to in order to actually meet the demand, right? So in short, the public company needs to perform better. And in order to do that, resources are associated. So we have that bind where we need to reinvest in some of our coal sector, which is in direct conflict with our demands, our visions of a fossil fuel phase out, right? And that's why the planning element is very important. It's to say, if we are going to be making this reinvestment while we are planning for new investments in generation, we need to ensure that there's adequate protections for workers and communities who are going to lose out in the process, because there will be people who lose, as we are already seeing it. There will be people who are losing out. But if the public remains mostly coal and as is often painted in the media, the public is mostly dirty, and dirty, I put dirty in quotation marks because the public company, the dirtiness is not just about the coal. It's also associated, the connection is made in people's mind that a public company is something fundamental about a big public company that's always corrupt. And that there's always dealing and there's always political influence, as though that doesn't exist in the private sector. But anyways, so we have this challenge with most high levels of unionization in a public sector that happens to be fossil fuel based, low levels of unionization, low levels of planning in a market-led private renewable energy pathway, and that's the future, right? So how can you ask workers who are being trade unionists, workers who are being organized in the coal sector, to move to a much more uncertain future, while many losses, like the case of Komati, are taking place, which show them empirically, that communities and workers are going to lose out. No matter what you say in your research report, no matter what you say in your climate models, what they are seeing at the shop floor is an erosion of benefits and people being left behind. And so I think that the purpose of what we are doing and the purpose of our politics around the taking ownership of the transition, we want to create positive examples. We want to force the door open by ensuring that there are collective bargaining agreements, that there are bargaining councils that are being created, and that just transitions come as a byproduct of negotiations, right? That we are winning negotiations case by case, and we are reclaiming the planning process. We are reclaiming the public pathway, right? And we're going to build that pathway through struggle. Mm-hmm. Right? So that is what we are saying. And as we make those positive examples along the way, it will gain confidence in workers who are in sectors that are especially vulnerable, that it's time to make that leap, right? So as a roundabout way of saying, in order to address load shedding, the major key element is to improve the performance of existing infrastructure. Unfortunately for South Africa, that is mostly coal. While we are doing that, we need to ensure that we win policy fights, and we also win fights at the plants that are going to be decommissioned, to ensure that we have positive cases that will help us build a platform to encourage workers to move towards a transition and away from coal. Because there are many people who are cynical and as time goes on, I suppose, are rightly cynical, right? Because of what they are seeing. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really, really interesting. Ale, why don't you have your question, and then Sarbisara, I'm gonna ask you to also read yours after Ale, after Brian responds. Ale, go ahead.
It goes straight to the point that you were speaking just now about this thing that when an enterprise is closing and people are losing their jobs, it's more like a comment and also a question, because I don't know if you have the answer, but what's your idea of how to build that strength to really get to a collective bargaining agreement in which the job losses are put into the discussion, because it's never a discussion. People just lose their jobs, and it's very hard to really take that into the discussion with the enterprises and, of course, the governments in case of public enterprises.
Perhaps, Ali, you want to introduce yourself? Ali's.
I'm a tutor. I'm from Argentina, and I'm part of the trade union of pharmaceutical representatives, and it happens all the time in the union that people lose their jobs because companies merge into each other and people lose their jobs, and it's a very hard situation for us. And I'm looking for inspiration too. Of course, it's a different sector, but on how to when these kind of things happen, that companies merge or when companies close, what do we do to really protect the jobs?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. So I have three bits of it, right? So I was supporting workers at at Komati in the year before it closed, right? We were ultimately quite unsuccessful in getting to the stage of bargaining council. And there's three things for me. The first one is about leverage, right? So where is your point of leverage? And for the workers at the power station, it would have been to have organized this bargaining council much sooner than a few months or a year before they close, right? And load shedding, the previous question around load shedding was also a key point, is that better messaging could have come through from the trade union and from organized workers to say, we can, the meta narrative within the country is that these plants are so old. The actual plant that we're talking about was built in the 1960s. So that these plants are so old, they cannot be fixed. So if the workers have a different story to tell, because some of them have been working there for 15 years, they say, look, we're in a short-term crisis. People are being load shedded. Hospitals don't have power. Can we as workers say that we are capable of performing at a level that will ensure that some of that is reduced? That would have been that's a different message to the public, right? And load shedding itself could have been some of the leverage. The second part is about political leadership. The union did not take political leadership on the issue, and partly because there's a internal division around the question of the energy transition. Not everybody agrees with it, and there's a whole spread of reasons why. There's a whole range. We don't necessarily need to. We can get into it if you want, but there's divided opinion about the validity of the energy transition itself. And at that moment, they were unwilling to take political leadership on the issue. We needed somebody to do that. The third part, I think, is around alternatives. I think there is a sense of, and these plants are located far away from the urban centers. They're highly concentrated, and like I mentioned, some of the people who are working in the sector have been working on that plant for maybe 10, 15 years. And there's a sense that this is coal country and it will always be coal country. And I know this is not a new story to the world at all, but there's a bit of inertia. People do not really believe, or it cannot really be over. It's just going to end. Everything's just going, all the money that is moving into this area is just going to disappear. And so right up until the last few months, while there was still uncertainty on people's jobs, I think there was a real belief that there was going to be a change. People were going to change their mind because it's just too much. So I think reality was hard to set in, and more work needed to be done leading up to that point to communicate that this, first of all, this has happened in many other places. Maybe go see them, and so on. So I hope that yeah. In essence, workers were quite isolated. And also the realities around the transition are often communicated at a scale and in a language that is hard to relate to. Climate change feels like an existential issue. When you're talking to people at a site that is about to be decommissioned, they say, well, like, what does this have to me? They're still burning coal in Germany. I'm just in South Africa. Why do I need to have this closed down? So that's what I'm saying now is an actual quote that came up from the site, and those emotions are all in the pot.
Thank you very much, Brian. So there are a few questions in the chat, and we have less than 10 minutes. So Sarah, would you like to make your question? And there seem to be a lot of people want to have the last word from you, Brian, also on, is there any role for the private sector in the energy, especially in serving the poor? But I let first Sabasara, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah. Actually, just I don't know whether it is related to your topic or not, but I'm reading, how big is the solar energy market in Africa, South Africa, and how much is owned by public and how much is by the private sector? If it is mostly owned by private sector, how cost effective electricity would be for the poor? Would private corporate ownership of renewable energy will be helpful for the poor and vulnerable in the long run? what could be the alternative if it is not so? So thank you. Myself Sarveshwar, and I am also a tutor with the online academy.
From India. And Jokonaya, do you want to make your question too? Jokonaya, can you hear us?
This is Philip Sapo. Unfortunately, I could not change the name. My question is that anytime there is a merge in two companies, what happens is the labor force, which experience some kind of challenges because they are layouts, the companies become one and it becomes very small, and therefore they will need a few employee to work in that. So there is redundancy there, and it becomes difficult for a lot of people to work. My question is that what can the union do in such issues? Because merging also strengthens the companies. Sometimes there may be one not working very well, and the moment they merge, they become a very strong force and they help the economy or the particular country. So what can the union also do in that regard to help their members so that they also don't suffer that short?
Brian, would you want to go and respond to both questions? And yeah, perhaps we also as a way of wrapping up the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. My 16-month-old daughter is also in the room, so if you hear her, she also has opinions on this matter. Okay, look, the first part is about the solar. So I think there are a few things that we need to keep in mind, right? South Africa has the majority of the demand for solar on the African continent. Most of it is utility scale. So that's the big solar plants. But in the last 18 months or so, there's been a big uptake in the embedded generation. So that's on commercial businesses, some home solar, mostly the home solars in upper middle class and upwards households, right? There have been legislative changes that have allowed incentives for companies to build their own private generation capacity. That's the more small scale stuff on shopping malls, on some big ones on mines, but also small commercial enterprises, retailers, and so on. And almost all solar in South Africa is currently private. And solar is quite cheap. There have been tariffs as low as 50 cents per kilowatt hour. Well, that's South African cents, so I don't know what is that in dollars. I'm not sure. 8 cents, 6 cents. Problem is this, right? You have to, in order to, most of the solar that is connected to the grid, right? It's not standalone solar. So we're not even talking about solar with batteries. It's codependent with the public infrastructure. So you're really not, that price that I mentioned, that 50 cents, South African cents, it's not really reflective of the total cost of what it takes to provide electricity to a particular connection point. We have 85% electrification in South Africa, so there's still 15% of households who don't. But most people have gained access to electricity through connection to the grid. And that is true all over. African continent is home to 2 out of 3 of every person without electricity in the world. But in North Africa and Southern Africa, where they're the highest electrification rates, the majority of it is grid connection. And even in the plans up to stated policies up to 2050, I think 43% of the new planned connections are from grid connections, right? 30% from microgrids, and most of the microgrids would be solar and some batteries. So that's a roundabout way of saying we need to keep things in context, right? If there's going to be new big solar in the grid that's impacting the mix of electricity you get from your grid network, that we are arguing should be public. There may be a small amount of private and private, I agree with you, private in this case could be cooperative. Could be cooperatively run. Some of it could be owned by a small amount could be owned by commercial enterprises themselves, but relatively insignificant within the scale of the big transformations we're talking about. Could remain private, but really we're talking about quite massive investments here and quite a massive undertaking that we're saying should be owned and operated by the public, right? I just want to make that clear. And it's not, in that case, it's also not only solar. We see in every economy that has large amounts of solar, even where there isn't coal, you need complementary energy resources, not just batteries. South Africa doesn't have much prospects for new hydropower. So in terms of, I'm not advocating for gas, I'm telling you that the stated policy is saying that more wind and solar will be accompanied by more importation of gas for the use of, for use in power, to complement the variability of renewable energy resources. That's the stated plan. So when we talk about the cheapness of solar, that's also part of the mix, is that there are complementary investments in infrastructure that are going to be required for those additional resources and for the purchase of the power from those resources as well, that are coming in to meet what solar cannot provide. So all of that, that's just the power part. The social policy part is that how electricity is priced, like I mentioned about the revenue and taxes. If we're not allowed to adjust how taxes are, how we are taxed, then what we are saying is that all these new investments that I've just listed will have to come from an increase in tariffs. And for households, many people do not have homes that have roofs that are suitable for solar panels. Should they be paying for that, for middle income and up, to have solar panels on their roof when they don't have a roof over their head? How will that question be resolved in a tariff structure that is market led, right? So we're saying we need to. Yeah, I think you get the point. So I hope that captures that part. In terms of the merging, our company is being split, not merged. So it's, in that sense, it's quite different, and we're still in the process of that. So I don't have a good answer for it. Only one of the company boards was populated in the last couple of weeks. So I think you've raised an important point, and we're going to need to keep an eye on that, but also to say that unions should play a key role in identifying what the mandate of these companies are, because sometimes what is considered a redundancy is a political question as well. And what is considered the scope and the mandate of the company is a political question. Are the objectives defined by a profit, or do they also consider social objectives, like delivering electricity to people we know who cannot afford it? The public company currently does that. Will a private company do the same?
Well, thank you very much, Brian. The struggle seems to will be going on for a long time, whether the path ahead is going to be one still driven by profit or by the needs of people and workers. So I think it was really important and interesting to have this conversation in South Africa, which I think perhaps is a foretold story also for other countries in terms of what is weighting the energy systems in these countries. So thanks a lot to everyone also for your questions in the chat box and taking the floor. And we are going to meet tomorrow actually at 3 o'clock again. So see you then, and really, really thank you, Brian, for taking time despite everything going on. Very much appreciated.